Welcome to the Bayaan Collective and South Asian Political Ecology Network first video segment. Here with me today is
Casey Williams.
And I am Saad and we will be discussing discussing the Sundarbans and what has happened recently. There were a water vessel carrying 350,000 tons of furnace oil had gotten into an accident. There was some mechanical failure and it sunk in the Sela River of the Sundarbans. The tributary that it was going through, that the boat was going through, is very environmentally fragile. There are many near extinct species that are there, both visible to the naked eye and also invisible. There are many people who are dependent on the resources who live around there, and Sundarbans itself is meant to be protecting the rest of mainland Bangladesh from a lot of environmental catastrophes. And the Sundarbans, like the rest of coastal Bangladesh, it is always under threat from rapid sea level rise. So given these problems, Sundarbans is, to everyone in Bangladesh, this is an important and it is known as a fragile place. But the oil spill that has taken place, since then, an oil spill is a very, very graphic phenomena when it takes place. So this outburst in the media, it happened in the form of reports from journalists which came out, which showed the Sundarbans is under oil. It is all blackened out, tarred out. Dolphins, tigers, and other animals, or the mangrove tree, the Sundari tree, they all show them half immersed in oil, and they're coming out as if they're almost choked. And this probably is what happened. Now, newspapers have always been there, and they've always covered the other side of the news, and the media creates a hype. But this time around, and for the last few years, in Bangladesh, we've been seeing a massive hype in social media as well. So on Facebook, there are some 3,220 people in a group called Save the Sundarbans. And we will be discussing about some of their activities and what these groups have been up to. What is the other side of having activities like this? Do we see an ambivalence, and do we see a repetition of the problem the Sundarbans is facing, and this sort of a movement, which we may call, or this sort of a protest, which may be in isolation or which may be in unification. But what are the implications of doing this? Okay, see?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing we want to think about is the extent to which this was an isolated incident.
Yeah.
So a lot of the responses to the oil spill have, if not, explicitly, at least sort of tacitly framed it as a kind of one-off phenomenon, right? This was a spectacular, immediate event that shouldn't have happened, and, that's sort of deserving of some kind of moral outrage and some kind of immediate response.
Absolutely, yeah.
What I think is important to remember, though, is two things. The first is that this is indicative of much larger sort of structural problems, right? Globalization, the circulation of capital globally has precipitated environmental degradation in many, many places around the globe. And it's important to see this as in that context. So it's not just something that happened once. It's not a failure of policy. It's not a failure of, the ship driver. Right, it's a direct result of the spread of a capitalist system of exchange. And if we think about it in that way, we have to start asking sort of bigger questions, right, that look further back in history. So why are there channels through the Sundarbans? Why are there markets for furnace oil? Why are we shipping goods in this way? And those sorts of things.
Who is shipping these goods?
Who's shipping these goods, exactly. And then when we expand the scope of the problem to include sort of global systems of trade and exchange, we change the way we think about potential solutions, right? So,
Absolutely, yeah.
and we'll come back to this in a moment, but potential solutions stop being about sort of the immediate problem, and they start being broader in scope, and they start forcing us to think about basically the way markets work, right? The way power and capital is distributed globally. And then, of course, the second sort of issue, big issue here is that this is a kind of spectacular immediate environmental degradation, but it sort of is a stand-in for environmental degradation that happens over much longer timescales in a way that's dispersed and slow. And one critique of these reactions, these movements that have cropped up in the wake of the Sundarbans oil spill, is that they risk obscuring some of these slower forms of environmental degradation, like deforestation.
Absolutely, and environmental deterioration, which takes place from so many angles, and it is nothing new. It's been well written about that environmental problems have been recurrent since man started lighting fire, or even before, since the time civilization has taken place. And human beings, most naturally in subsistence conditions, are always more dependent on nature and its value systems. And something like a forest, and especially like the Sundarbans, which is a mangrove forest, it's home to so many different resources which provide livelihoods to many people. Now, forests like the Sundarbans and many others, during the time of colonization, and this land it not only provided a way in for settlers and traders to come in, but it also provided the products of which to trade with, which included many medicinal herbs, hide of tigers and other animals, deer, which was used for hunting, wild boar. And as you come in, you naturally man conquers the land which is which is seen as natural, and you romanticize about the natural. And then what happens is you slowly start deteriorating the state of nature. So what has happened in the Sundarbans today is, I'm not saying a direct result, but slowly, every day, we're seeing some kind of environmental deterioration which takes place. Now, that from colonialism, you get into state building, post-colonial state building, and that state building includes building large infrastructure, which takes place on places like the Sundarbans, which takes place on its borders. Part of another problem with Sundarbans is the Rampal coal plant, where they're going to be manufacturing and building coal right on one of the entrances into the forest. And that's very problematic as to where the residue will go. If there is a problem, if there is a hazard, then naturally the surroundings will be hurt. And if that is the forest, then you're looking for doom again. There's another blackening problem. So you look at the oil spill. The oil spill alone is not a problem. It's just one indication. It's a very important indication, but it's one indicator out of several hundreds of thousands.
Sure.
And yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that we focus on something like the oil spill is because it seems obviously bad. It's very clear that something like an oil spill shouldn't happen and causes problems that nobody really wants to deal with. Whereas if we put it in the context of something like post-colonial nation building, it becomes much more complicated, right? You have to clear forests in order to have agricultural land, in order to feed your people, right? You have to, this whole rhetoric of food security in Bangladesh, which is an incredibly important issue, in some ways relies on a certain kind of environmental degradation.
Yeah.
And
infrastructure building as well.
Infrastructure building,
that's main,
exactly.
Yeah, especially in the Sundarbans, actually, it's very interesting because Sundarbans is swampland. What is a swamp? It's mixture between land and water bodies. You can't clear and have agricultural bodies there. So what do? You build up, because it's it's unarable, the cleared land. So you build infrastructure. So that's another big.
Absolutely, you make polders.
You make Rampal, or projects like that. And there are several other business conglomerates who are trying to grab land on the outskirts, and that's a big problem.
Right. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. And it creates, this really interesting double bind for people who live there. The economic development like this in some ways makes subsistence living very difficult, right? If you have the encroachment of roads, of agricultural land that replaces forests, those kinds of things, subsistence living is a lot more difficult than it might have been in the past.
Before we talk about the problem of the market system emergence in this, let's get back to the crux of our discussion, which includes talking about this movement that has taken place. So a lot of the articles that have taken place, and I spoke about the Save the Sundarbans group either. Everyone seems to feel a little bit patronizing of the forest as such, where it is our forest, and this goes hand in hand on what we were talking about, infrastructure building. So you are talking about infrastructure building or land grabbing, nation building that we're talking about. And there is a certain bit of patriotism, there's a bit of nationalism involved in this, where you talk about the Sundarbans not for its essence or not for the services it provides, but it's yours, because you are one of the owners of the forest as such, And the group is titled Save the Sundarbans. I mean, you are coming from these groups are run by who? These groups are not run by the forest. These groups are run by people like us who are from the cities. These people, they're not even living in the Sundarbans. Maybe some of them work there, but it comes from a structure of power, which is what gives them the agency to say that we are entitled to save the forest because it's ours. So it's a mix, it's a hotspot of, just like the Sundarbans itself, which is a hotspot of lots of biodiverse activity. This is a hotspot of a bit of nationalism, a bit of given agency.
Sure.
Capitalist problems, global capitalist problems, market system.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think it's important and worth mentioning that the people who are starting these movements and participating in these movements come from a very good place, right?
Of course.
I think there's a genuine appreciation for the damage that environmental problems like this can cause and the need to address them using grassroots means. And so, I think we should give credit where credit's due there.
Utterly, yes.
But I think what you're saying about this rhetoric of ownership and saving the Sundarbans is really important. This whole idea of ownership is what undergirds the whole system of capitalist exchange, right? So anytime we defer to ownership to justify a political action, we're in some sense reproducing the very logic that caused the problem in the first place.
Yeah.
And then the rhetoric of saving, to me, has at least two problems. The first is I think it encourages a kind of what you might call a preservationist ethic, where we say, look, we need to preserve the forest in its natural state while kind of forgetting the fact that there are people who live there and have lived there for long time. And when we do that, when we think about, the forest as a kind of isolated bit of nature, we risk really undervaluing the people who live there and forgetting that they need to draw resources from the forest in order to make a life for themselves.
Services, yeah.
And then the second problem I think with the savior rhetoric is just that, and this is exactly what you were saying, is that it assumes a kind of human, the legitimacy of human mastery over nature, human mastery
Absolutely.
over the environment, and it's it's precisely this kind of human entitlement, this idea of human exceptionalism that in some ways allowed these problems to happen in the first place, right? If we think that we can control nature, if we think that we have a legitimate title to its use and exploitation, then we think a lot less about the consequences of some of our actions.
And saving as well is part of use and its actions. Again, I completely concur with you on the fact that these are good-hearted individuals with very good intentions, but These are problematics that we try to reflect on that have come up, and this is not usually seen in the media as to why, as to these movements, because they're trying to do such a good job. We're just trying to discuss the other side of
Sure.
being good-natured.
No, of course, and
Yeah,
it's really
yeah,
important
yeah.
to discuss these things, right?
Yeah.
Because the way that we make sense of these problems, determines the kind of political outcomes that we're going to see.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
if we fail to see these problems in their proper context, then the efficacy of our political actions is going to be drastically limited.
drastically limited, and also drastically opposing, drastically negative as well. Maybe we fear that out of such projects.
Right.
But again, going back to the point of man versus nature, I mean, to me, if you want to save the forest, it's not too different than when somebody used to go hunt for tigers. Maybe some people still do, but it used to be a big game during the colonial era and afterwards. I mean, Amitav Ghosh, Chitra Devakurni Banerjee has an entire chapter dedicated to an entire book which is dedicated to hunting, and the basis of the book is founded on the fact that somebody had died while going hunting, and then the other person who came back was the then became the lord of the house. He was some younger brother or something like that. But again, I mean, the point is, this is not too different than going and capturing the tiger. If you're trying to save the forest, and if you're trying to go and hunt tigers, you're on the same panel. You're on the same equilibrium. So this idea of power, this agency which is granted to those who are leading this movement, this protest rally, March for Sundarbans, I mean, they are given this agency because of, like, what is the source of this empowerment? And I think it's because of neoliberalism empowered by global capital. And I think we should discuss both these concepts of global capital, the rise of capitalism, and its effects in the Bengal Delta.
Yeah, so what we're interested in thinking about is how people's personal investments in neoliberalism, in really any sort of system of exchange and power distribution, how that influences the way that they structure movements in response to something like the Sundarbans oil spill. And whether or not these investments are sort of explicitly or overtly stated, whether or not they're explicit motivations for behaving in a certain way, they inevitably influence the way that we frame a problem, right? It's very difficult to justify a response to an oil spill that would force you to cede any of your own power. And this is something that's true for us as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
The idea of capital is very, very alluring, and sometimes it's so subtle yet alluring that you don't understand that it has come to affect you.
Absolutely.
With, I mean, the need for furnace oil, the need for it to be transported. And it's a basic commodity. Furnace oil is used very interchangeably in Bangladesh for a lot of things, including cooking. So, what makes us drive for this?
Absolutely.
For this kind of a fossil fuel? I mean, certainly, if we didn't have technology, would we be using this?
Right.
If we didn't have the advent of capitalism, if we didn't have colonialism, if there was this kind of grab, if such technology didn't exist, these are all offshoots of capitalism which we see in different modes, and which is again why I'll keep on reiterating the fact that this is not an oil spill is only one symbol of the larger needs, the larger problems, and better. I mean, of course, you need better solutions other than the ones that are being talking about right now.
And why don't we talk about some of the specific solutions?
Yeah, some of the specific solutions. One which is again very, very prevalent in Bangladesh and the rest of the world as well, but it's on creating awareness. Within the idea of creating awareness, you do so much. and one of them is marching to the Sundarbans, going there and visiting what has gone wrong, what people has done. Lots of positivity has taken place. Lots of people have helped with equipment to extract the oil and give back the natural flora and fauna that has taken place. But really, if you're taking people from Dhaka or the rest of the country and marching into the Sundarbans, what are you doing? Are you doing anything? You're just creating a hype. Sure. And it's a very good hype. Because the Sundarbans is beautiful, so a visit down there would be nice. But, of course, yeah. Have you been?
No, I haven't been recently. Yeah.
I've been several times, and it is beautiful, but this kind of a visit, in the name of creating awareness, in the name of solving the issue, does not cause a panacea of any kind.
Well, we have to think about questions of efficacy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what does an awareness-raising campaign achieve? I mean, it introduces people to the problem, but it's not clear, and maybe it has some short-term policy implications. I mean, I think that would be the best-case scenario. And in this case, I mean, things have been happening, right? People have been able to skim the oil off the top. They have been able to, recuperate.
That's everyday resistance. They needed to save themselves.
Absolutely.
So they have to use whatever they can.
Absolutely.
Awareness does have its own economic benefits, and the people over there might have benefited a tiny amount, somewhat, but that's still.
But I think you're right that that's a lot of the cleanup efforts arguably would have happened, absent this sort of awareness-raising movement, right? Because people have to live there. People, have no choice but to sort of deal with this ecological catastrophe in order to just move on to the next day. And I think when we think about questions of efficacy, we have to expand our scope of thinking, and we have to ask ourselves, is a movement effective if it fails even to illuminate some of the structural problems that underlie, a given event?
So the actor Mark Ruffalo has endorsed the activities of a certain organization called Water Defense. Water Defense is US based, and it's funded by lots of other famous people as well. And their program has, again, grabbed a lot of attention from different walks of life, different walks of global society. And when I say global society, I mean those who have access to social media and global media like The Guardian, New York Times, the larger ones. So global society has really looked at what Mark Ruffalo and Water Defense are doing. But what are they doing? They're collecting funds from everyone, and through PayPal you can pay to get a fund ready, which will send scientists from the West to Bangladesh to work with local scientists and do their capacity building, and that is to test the water quality over here. Now, I'm not saying that they're doing anything malicious, or I'm not trying to assess them, but what I'm saying is, when you do have that kind of an activity where you're only testing the water, had the water been tested before the oil spill? If it had been, what did it say? And what will new tests say? That this water quality is back to the old quality, or this water quality is perfect? But people have been living without water tests for centuries, and I mean, what is this data going to do? And this sort of hyperactiveness that you see on the internet over this kind of stardust spread by Mark Ruffalo. How would you respond to this kind of a take?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because people often want to feel like they're doing something in response to these kinds of things, especially if they feel a sense of moral outrage or political outrage. Here, what I think this illustrates is the importance of framing, right? So, if we frame the oil spill as a primarily scientific problem, right? If we think about it in terms of the way oil molecules are drifting across the surface, the way that they're interacting with different species in the ecosystem, then the solutions that we come up with are going to be scientific, right? And so testing for water qualities becomes a sort of logical response to this problem because it fits the frame. And this is always true for the way that we sort of talk about problems and construe problems. And I think in this case it's unfortunate because the problem is in one sense, a scientific problem. In one sense, it's about the way ecosystems function. But really, it's a political problem, right? It's a problem about the way that these kinds of ecosystems are managed and the way that human beings interact with them. And it's a problem of priorities, right? And I think the fact that we think about Sundarbans in such narrow terms is indicative of an issue with our priorities. I think we value human development, and I think capitalism is maybe an indication of our value of human development, without really understanding the way ecology, plays into that development, without understanding human reliance on ecosystems, the way that we interact with them, and our need for them.
Which is completely qualitative.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and so scientific data as such, I mean, what is science anyways? What does it help you do? Well, sure, to crunch up more activities like this, but again, it's not holistic. It doesn't address the needs, and it might help people understand that they have better water, but as long as they're getting by, I think they're fine. It's another intervention.
Sure.
Over there, it's a scientific project that seems like that's going on. If they're trying to find data on the Sundarbans time and again.
Sure.
I mean, I think this has many both micro and macro political level implications of projects like this, right?
Sure. I mean, we can think of it of an issue of competing stories, right? Quantitative data about water quality or anything else, it tells a very particular kind of story about the Sundarbans. It tells a story of an ecosystem that's fragile, that's that can be harmed by oil or other kinds of foreign agents sort of coming in. But the stories that it crowds out, the stories about real human beings, the stories about systems and differentials of power, the story about the way global systems of exchange benefit some and marginalize other. All of those stories get lost when we reduce it to statistics, or when we frame it in purely environmental terms, or when we think of it as an isolated incident. In some sense, whenever we have kind of a failure of imagination, whenever we're unable to see things in their proper context.
I mean, yes. I mean, the scientific data is necessary and it should be there. But along with it, what is there? I mean, this is one sort of activity that has popped up. The other one is on a website called avaz.org. These are run by expatriate Bangladeshis, I believe, and they have been writing a petition to send to UNESCO. UNESCO has already labeled the Sundarbans as a World Heritage Site, right? But now the new petition is, since the oil spill, that we will label this as the world's most dangerous heritage site. They use the term most dangerous. And this kind of, again, hyperactivity, this not smear campaign, but scare campaign against the forest, against the east from the west. I mean, this has its own implications. What is the necessity of doing this? I mean, what will this accrue? In my opinion, what this accrues is a neoliberal, a completely neoliberal, imperial tendency of labeling a problem according to the mother countries, sort of the colonists, the imperialist rhetoric.
But I think maybe another way of thinking about this is in terms of questions of value.
Yes, exactly. I was coming to that. That instead of the value being on the forest itself and not on the resistance that has taken place over there against this intrusion, this horrible intrusion, they now want to take it to a higher level and value it according to somebody else's value principles, not the forest. So what does a World Heritage? What did it mean before, and what will this mean? I mean, will there be more protection, or will there's no charter? There's no sort of policy to counter neoliberalism. That is never present.
Right.
Yeah.
And it raises all of these interesting questions, right? Like, who gets to decide which spaces have value and for whom? And if we allow our our evaluation of different places to depend on criteria developed by neoliberal institutions or institutions invested in neoliberal politics or economics, then we allow all kinds of spaces that have different kinds of value to different kinds of people to sort of fall outside the scope of our concern. And maybe the Sundarbans gets listed as a particularly vulnerable site according to UNESCO, but what places in Bangladesh and around the world don't get that privilege, right? And why not? And I think anytime we allow something like the UNESCO brand to legitimate our concern, right? We allow the fact that it's a UNESCO heritage site to be a reason why we intervene. Then we sort of make legitimate these systems of evaluation that are basically originating outside of the country and that reflect the values of people who don't live there.
Dear viewers, thank you for listening to us. Stay tuned in to watch many videos of similar topics.
Yeah, so this is the first video installment of what we hope to be a series of videos hosted by the South Asian Political Ecology Network, which is a collaboration with Bayaan Collective. And so we're a group of people who are interested in dissecting a range of issues from the perspective of political ecology. And we have a page on the Bayaan Collective site, which is bayaancollective.org. And there you can see what we're talking about. We're trying to experiment with new methodologies. We're trying to play around with the field of political ecology and just think about big issues from the perspective of political ecological thinking. So thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it.